And These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. 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 Engage forward shields, 35%. Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Zionist occupying forces terrorize Tel Aviv and Ariha. Watch this space. Russian Foreign Ministry. Israel police crackdown on legal reform protests. This is MalaysiaNow.com. The rally in Tel Aviv came as lawmakers in Jerusalem passed in preliminary reading a bill limiting the chances of a prime minister being impeached. Let's try that again. Israel police crack down on legal reform protests. The rally in Tel Aviv came as lawmakers in Jerusalem passed in preliminary reading a bill limiting the chances of prime minister being impeached. Israel police on horses used stun grenades during a demonstration as the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's nationalist coalition government presses on with its contentious judicial overhaul in Tel Aviv, Israel, March 1st. Israel police clashed Wednesday with protesters rallying against the government's judicial reform program, which critics say threatens democracy, as lawmakers held a preliminary vote on the last controversial bill. And this is Malaysia Now. Demonstrators in Tel Aviv blocked some streets, and police employed stun grenades, water cannons, and officers on horseback in a rare use of force in the coastal city of AFP journalists said. Some 39 people were arrested for allegedly rioting and not obeying instructions by police officials, police said in a statement. 11 wounded protesters arrived at Tel Aviv's Ichalov Hospital, a spokesman for the facility told AFP. "I'm here for democracy, for human rights, for justice," demonstrator Johan Kanal, 39, told AFP in Tel Aviv. Another protester, 51-year-old lawyer Donna Niren, said, "We're blocking all the intersections. We're stopping the entire traffic in the entire country and hope that the current government will understand that we're dead serious and that we'll do everything in our power to change the current path that they're taking." Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hit back in a televised statement. "The right to demonstrate is not the right to block the country," he said, accusing demonstrators of crossing a red line. "A sovereign country cannot tolerate anarchy," added Netanyahu, who returned to power late last year at the head of a coalition with ultra-Orthodox Jewish and extreme right allies. The premier earlier stressed his support for the police, who are acting against lawbreakers who are disrupting Israeli citizens' daily lives. The rally in Tel Aviv came as lawmakers in Jerusalem passed in preliminary reading a bill limiting the chances of Prime Minister being impeached. Opponents say the measures aimed at protecting Netanyahu, who's on trial for corruption, and charges he denies. These are charges he denies. MPs voted 62-20 in favor of the legislation, which proposes a three-quarter parliamentary majority to impeach a premier due to physical or mental incapacity. Following the initial vote, the bill will pass to a parliamentary committee to consider whether it be scrapped or returned to the chamber to continue the legislative process. The broader judicial reform announced in January includes measures that critics argue are intended to hand politicians more power at the expense of the judiciary. Netanyahu and his Justice Minister Yair Lapid argued the change is necessary to reset the balance between elected officials and the Supreme Court, which they view as politicized. Lawmakers also passed in preliminary reading a bill to impose the death penalty on terrorists, with 55 MPs in favor and 9 against. Extreme right politicians have repeatedly attempted to pass such legislation in the 120-seat chamber, but have failed to garner enough support. Israel abolished the use of capital punishment for murder in civil courts in 1954, though it can still, in theory, be applied for war crimes against humanity, genocide, treason, and crimes against the Jewish people. And from Press TV, Israel police fire stun grenades, tear gas as anti-regime protests rage on. Israel police have used tear gas, water cannons, and stun grenades to disperse protesters against highly contested plans by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right cabinet to reform the occupying regime's judiciary. The violence broke out after hundreds of demonstrators blocked roads and chanted anti-Netanyahu slogans in central Tel Aviv and other places across the occupied territories as part of a Disruption Day protests on Wednesday. Police on horseback tried to stop demonstrators breaching barricades in Tel Aviv, with footage showing the regime's forces dragging protesters off the road as demonstrators called out "shame" and "we're the majority and we're out on the streets." Israeli media said the police, for the first time since protests began some 2 months ago, deployed tear gas, stun grenades, and water cannons to disperse demonstrators, adding that at least 11 people sustained injuries in altercations with police, and 39 others were arrested in the mass rallies. In one video widely shared, an Israeli cop was seen to kneel on the neck of a protester to subdue him, while several others held him down. The screen captured from a video shows an Israeli cop kneeling on the neck of that protester. And following the police dispersing protesters in Tel Aviv, the Israeli regime, their opposition leader Yair Lapid, informed the press that he had left the Knesset in order to join the protests, with Netanyahu accusing him of sowing anarchy. Protests have taken place across the occupied territory since Netanyahu's controversial move to reform the judiciary. Opponents argue that the legal changes threaten the independence of judges and weaken oversight of the ruling cabinet and parliament. They say the plan will undermine the rights of minorities and open the door to more corruption. Opponents also say the judicial overhaul is meant to help Netanyahu avoid the repercussions of his ongoing corruption case, including bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Netanyahu, however, has called the protesters anarchists, claiming that they cannot come to terms with last November's elections, which helped him stage a comeback as prime minister. The embattled premier also alleges that the reforms are required to curtail the jurisdiction of the sitting judges, whom he accuses of having too much power. And from protomalo.com, this is Israeli police crackdown, clash with anti-Netanyahu protests. Weeks of anti-government protests in Israel turned violent on Wednesday for the first time as police fired stun grenades and a water cannon at demonstrators who blocked the Tel Aviv highway. The crackdown came shortly after Israel's hardline national security minister urged a tough response to what he said were anarchists. The violence came as thousands across the country launched a national disruption day against the government's plan to overhaul Israel's judicial system. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's allies say the program's meant to reduce the influence of unelected judges, but critics, including influential business leaders and former military figures, say Netanyahu's pushing the country toward authoritarian rule and has a clear conflict of interest in targeting judges as he stands trial on corruption charges. Since Netanyahu's government took office 2 months ago, tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest the changes, which they say endanger Israel's fragile system of checks and balances. Wednesday, however, marked the first time police used force against the crowds. The government is barreling ahead with the legal changes, and a parliamentary committee is moving forward on a bill that will weaken the Supreme Court. And I guess when they say, it marked the first time police used force against the crowds, they don't mean non-Palestinians and Palestine-driven disruptions or protests. I'm sure those forces have been used in those. The government's barreling ahead with the legal changes in parliamentary committees moving forward on a bill that would weaken that Supreme Court. The crisis has sent shockwaves through Israel and presented Netanyahu with a serious challenge. A wave of Israeli-Palestinian violence in the occupied West Bank has compounded his troubles. The rival sides are digging in, deepening one of Israel's worst domestic crises. Netanyahu and his government, made up of ultranationalists, have branded the protesters anarchists while stopping short of condemning a West Bank settler mob that torched a Palestinian town earlier this week. The legal overhaul has sparked an unprecedented uproar with weeks of mass protests, criticism from legal experts, and rare demonstrations by Army reservists who pledged to disobey orders under what they say will be a dictatorship after the overhaul passes. Business leaders, the country's booming tech sector, and leading economists have warned of economic turmoil under the judicial changes. Israel's international allies have expressed concern. In the first scenes of unrest since the protests began 2 months ago, police arrived on horseback in the center of the seaside metropolis of Tel Aviv, hurled stun grenades, and used a water cannon against thousands of protesters who chanted democracy and police state. A video posted on social media showed a police officer pinning down a protester with his knee on the man's neck, and another showed a man who reportedly had his ear ripped off by a stun grenade. Facing the police, protesters also chanted, "Where were you?" a reference to the absence of security forces during the settler attack on the Palestinian town of Hawara, which took hours to quell and which the military said it was not prepared for. Police said protesters threw rocks and water bottles at the officers. Police said they arrested 39 protesters in Tel Aviv for disturbing the peace, while 11 people were hospitalized with various injuries, including to Tel Aviv's Sorovsky Medical Center. Earlier Wednesday, protesters blocked Tel Aviv's main freeway and the highway connecting the city to Jerusalem, halting rush-hour traffic for about an hour. At busy train stations in Tel Aviv, protesters prevented trains from departing by blocking their doors. National Security Administrator Itamar Ben-Gvir, an ultranationalist accused of politicizing the police, has vowed to take a tough line. He called on police to prevent the road blockages, labeling the demonstrators anarchists. Netanyahu said Ben-Gvir had his full support, will not tolerate violence against police blocking roads and blatant breaches of the country's law. The right to protest is not the right to anarchy, he said. Netanyahu also blamed opposition leader Yair Lapid for fomenting anarchy. Lapid called on police to show restraint and said Netanyahu's government had lost control. "The protesters are patriots," Lapid tweeted. They are fighting for the values of freedom, justice, and democracy. The role of the police is to allow them to express their opinions and fight for the country they love. Thousands of protesters came out in locations across the country waving Israeli flags. Parents marched with their children. Tech workers walked out of work to demonstrate, and doctors in scrubs protested outside hospitals. The main rallies were expected later Wednesday outside the Knesset, or Parliament, and near Netanyahu's official residence in Jerusalem. Every person here is trying to keep Israel a democracy, and if the current government will get its way, then we're afraid we will no longer be a democracy or a free country, said Ariha Shapira, a protester in Tel Aviv. As a woman, as a mother, I'm very scared for my family and my friends. Justice Minister Yair Levine, the overhaul's main architect, said Tuesday that the coalition aims to ram through some of the judicial overhaul bills into law in the coming month before the parliament goes on recess for the Passover holiday on April 2nd. The Knesset also set to cast a preliminary vote Wednesday on a separate proposal to protect Netanyahu from being removed from his post, a move that comes following calls to the country's attorney general to declare him unfit for office. Netanyahu has been the center of years-long political crisis in Israel, with former allies turning on him and refusing to sit him in government because of his corruption charges. That political turmoil, with 5 elections in 4 years, culminated in Netanyahu returning to power late last year, with ultranationalist and ultra-Orthodox parties as partners in the current far-right government. Wielding immense political power, those allies secured top portfolios in Netanyahu's government, among them Ben-Gvir, who before entering politics was arrested dozens of times and was convicted of incitement to violence and support for a terror group. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, a firebrand West Bank settler leader who has been given authority over parts of the territory. And they've promised to take a tough stance against Palestinians, which has ratcheted up tension in recent weeks. Smotrich publicly called for a harsh response to the killing of 2 Israelis in the West Bank by a Palestinian gunman, saying Israel should go crazy shortly before Sunday's mob violence. While he later urged restraint, he also said Wednesday that Hawara, the Palestinian town that was attacked, should be erased. In addition to protests, Netanyahu's government, Israel's most right-wing ever, is beginning to show early cracks just 2 months into its tenure. The government says the legal changes are meant to correct an imbalance that's given the courts too much power and allowed them to meddle in the legislative process. They say the overhaul will streamline governance, and say elections last year, which returned Netanyahu to power with a slim majority in parliament, gave them a mandate to make the changes. Critics say the overhaul will upend Israel's system of checks and balances, granting the prime minister and the government unrestrained power and push the country toward authoritarianism. From Middle East Eye, Israel police assault protesters during anti-government marches. Demonstrators launched National Day of Disruption as government presses on with controversial judicial overhaul. Israel police violently dispersed protesters on Wednesday, and thousands marched in different cities to protest against the controversial government plan to overhaul the judicial system amid growing political turmoil. At least 11 people were wounded from bruises, cuts, and burns, according to a Tel Aviv hospital. Another 28 were arrested. Protesters declared Wednesday a national day of disruption, blocking vital roads and burning tires on highways. Marches were set to culminate in a large demonstration in Tel Aviv in front of the residence of the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Police have used stun grenades, water cannons, mounted officers to disperse demonstrators. These are fateful days for the country. That's why we're here, Omer Shemer, a protester told Middle East Eye from the site of the demonstration in Tel Aviv. The reaction of the police today is related to the instructions of Ben-Gvir. We are shouting. Where were you in Hawara? Because they did a pogrom there, and there are 0 arrestees, Shemer said. As protesters sought to block major transport intersections around Israel, the government instructed police officers to show tolerance. Far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir branded the protesters anarchists and told police to break up the gatherings. Will not allow a civil uprising and anarchists to block major roads, Ben-Gvir said. Israel's in the midst of a political crisis that's pitted Netanyahu's far-right government against the country's civil society, academic and business elite, and former government ministers and military figures. Crowds are protesting against a government that would give Parliament the power to override the Supreme Court through a simple majority vote and de facto control over court nominees. It would also limit the court's ability to bar legislation that infringes human and civil rights. Israel has no constitution, and there is little separation between the executive and legislative branches, as governments nearly always hold a majority in the parliament, the Knesset. This has historically meant the Supreme Court is the most effective check on government power. Observers said the use of violent dispersal methods by the police against secular Jewish Israeli protesters is almost unheard of. I think it's remarkable to see demonstrators' bold actions today in blocking vital roads and public facilities, and in return, the police violence. This suggests more violence will likely follow in the future, and this may lead to the fall of the government. Haifa-based analysis, Amir Mahmoud told MEE. Yeah, you see, but there's that saying, they came for the so-and-so, they came for the so-and-so, right? So the idea that they never used the quote-unquote the police against secular Jewish Israeli protest, that doesn't matter, because they always use the police against Palestinians. So people are desensitized to see the IDF, the ZOF, the IOF, to see them doing this is not really outstanding, because it's been allowed to be done on Palestinians constantly. So we can term them anarchists as opposed to terrorists, but just from a critical, analytical perspective, there is no difference. And these are demands from within the ruling Likud party. This is back to Middle East Eye, including from MP David Baton, which called for serious dialogue with the opposition. There are widening cracks within the governing coalition, which were reflected in reactions to the Huwara rampage, the Israeli PA Aqaba meeting, and the police's resentment towards Ben-Gvir, he said. Yonatan Tuval, an analyst at the Israel Institution for Regional Foreign Policies, MITFIM, told MEE that protests stand a chance at preventing and perhaps at the very least slowing down the legislative agenda of the government. A recent poll by the Israeli Democracy Institute found that 66% of Israelis believe the Supreme Court should not have its power curtailed. Speaking from the demonstration in Tel Aviv, Tuval said he was uncertain what impact the protests can have, but that mass protests were the only choice left. The only chance for the government's agenda to fail is if there is mass popular opposition and mass protests across the country. Internationally, at least, Tuval believes the ongoing protests are making it very difficult for Netanyahu to portray himself as a stable and solid leader. Speaking at the same rally earlier in the day, Yuval Diskin, the former head of the country's intelligence service, Shin Bet, warned about the growing polarization in Israel and the threat from the settlers. I wish to send condolences to the families of those killed in the Huwara terrorist attack, and I believe that Shin Bet will get the terrorists. My heart also goes out to the people of Huwara who were going through difficult times caused by Jewish rioters, said Diskin. These rioters and their rabbis are a threat to our security. We're in the midst of a difficult wave of terror, but do not fear, because the criminally accused has given our security to the TikTok minister, Diskin added. The weekend's rampage by settlers had been described as unprecedented in its nature, or has been described as unprecedented in its nature. At least one Palestinian was killed and nearly 400 were wounded in the attacks on Huwara and other West Bank towns and villages, Palestinian health officials said. Well, we could say it's unprecedented, right, that this rampage or these rampages, but I mean, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure that that's the case. I mean, if they have on uniforms, it's okay. And then also, I mean, when you think of like maybe the Ibrahimi Mosque situation, or even what happens in Al-Aqsa from time to time, and the protests were largely boycotted by Palestinian citizens of Israel who believe they're excluded from the anti-government protest movement according to Rami Yunus, an independent Palestinian journalist and former TV host on Israel's Public Broadcasting Corporation. Only now the protesters are finally starting to link the programs in Hawara by settlers and what the police and government's doing here in Israel, Yunus told MEE from Haifa. It's very hard for Palestinians to join the protests that wish to preserve the judicial status quo, which has been deepening the oppression of Palestinian citizens of Israel and deepening the apartheid in West Bank, he added. When a Palestinian friend of Yunus was invited to speak at anti-government protest almost 2 weeks ago, she was the only speaker who asked to send over her speech in advance so that the Israeli organizers can go over it, he said. And what do you know? They don't like the fact she had direct messages against the occupation and that you can't fight for a democracy that's occupying another people. She was banned from the demonstration. As protesters grow, an Israeli parliament committee approved restrictions on the Supreme Court's power to override laws, a significant part of the government's plan to overhaul the judiciary. The decision by the Knesset's Constitution, Law and Justice Committee gives Supreme Court judges the ability to overturn unconstitutional laws with 12 out of 15 votes in favor. Currently, the Supreme Court can disqualify government legislation if it contradicts Israel's 13 basic laws, particularly the Human Dignity and Liberty Basic Law. Israel's basic laws are intended to be part of a future constitution. And that's another part of it. How can a country not even have a constitution? The committee also approved an override clause which will allow parliament members to reenact a law disqualified by the Supreme Court with a simple majority of 61 MPs out of 120, essentially stripping the court of its ability to revoke unconstitutional laws. Netanyahu and his allies say the judicial reforms are necessary to correct the power imbalance between elected representatives and the nation's top courts, but the plans have drawn a fierce opposition from groups including lawyers and raised concerns among business leaders, widening already deep political divisions in Israel's society. And from the Jerusalem Post, Israel police chief says force will be used if officers are attacked. This is actually from beforehand. Let's just see what their approach was to the protest. Israel Police Commissioner Kobi Shabtai led a situational assessment with senior police officials on Wednesday evening amid escalating anti-government protests across Israel. Israel police sees the right to protest as a cornerstone of democratic state, but will not allow public disorder, nor will we allow any damage to be done to state symbols and property, Shabtai said following the assessment. Shabtai called on protesters to refrain from using provocation and violence against police officers and reaffirmed that police will only use force in response to violence against police or if dangers posed to Israeli citizens. And from IMEMC.org, Israeli soldiers kill a Palestinian, injure 2, abduct 6 in Jericho. Dozens of Israeli soldiers invaded Wednesday the Aqaba Yaver refugee camp in Ariha, Jericho, in the northeastern West Bank, exchanged fire with Palestinian fighters in a surrounded home, killed 1, and abducted at least 6 Palestinians. The soldiers initially took the Palestinian who was seriously injured to an Israeli hospital and later informed the Palestinian General Authority for Civil Affairs that the young man Mahmoud Jamal Hassan Hamdan, 22, has succumbed to his wounds. The Israeli army said it invaded the refugee camp to abduct Palestinians who are believed to be behind the Monday shooting attack that led to the death of Alan Ganelis, and added that one of them sustained serious wounds while trying to retreat from the area. Media sources said the soldiers surrounded the home of Mar Shalom, where Palestinian fighters were hiding, and exchanged fire with them before firing a rocket at it. I think it's very significant that this is like a regular practice to shoot a rocket at a building so that the building collapses and kills the people inside of it. This has to be a violation of some type of humane law, some law. relating to humane treatment. The army claimed the abducted Palestinians exchanged fire with the soldiers before they were taken prisoners and their weapons confiscated. Palestinian medics tried to reach the seriously wounded man to provide essential aid, but the soldiers blocked them before taking him away. The army initiated the attack by deploying undercover soldiers who surrounded and isolated the home before many army vehicles invaded the refugee camp. The soldiers also opened fire at a Palestinian car, shattering its windows before confiscating it, in addition to shooting a young man with a rubber-coated steel bullet to the head during ensuing protest. It's worth mentioning that Jericho, Ariha remained under strict siege for the third day while the army installed more roadblocks and placed sandhills on several streets. Earlier on Monday, 2 Israeli colonizers were killed in a shooting in Huwara near Nablus. On Sunday, a Palestinian civilian was killed by Israeli soldiers while in his home at Zatara village. Sameh Akhtash, who was murdered by Israeli forces Sunday, was in Turkey 2 weeks before, volunteering with a rescue team to save lives after the earthquake. On February 23, 2023, Israeli soldiers killed Mohammed Nabil Fauzi Abu Sabah, 29, in Jenin, in northern West Bank. And the day before Mohammed's death, Israeli soldiers killed 11 Palestinians, injured more than 102 seriously, and caused more than 250 Palestinians to suffer the effects of tear gas inhalation and other minor wounds. 1 Palestinian dead, several arrested in Israeli Jericho raid. The Israeli forces' detention of Palestinian in Ariha comes amidst efforts to pass a new law to allow the execution of Palestinians. Israeli forces raided the Aqaba Yaber refugee camp in Ariha in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday, 1 March, the International Middle East Media Center reported. Israeli soldiers surrounded and besieged a home before firing their weapons, wounding 3 and killing 1 of the occupants while arresting 5 more. The Israeli army claimed it besieged and then invaded the refugee camp to search for Palestinians involved in the killing of an Israeli driver in a shooting attack 2 days prior on 27 February. The Palestinian Prisoners Society said the detained Palestinians are all former political prisoners, including Abdul Nasser Musa Shaloun, Mar Shaloun, Amr Shaloun, Mohammed Shaloun, and his son Saleh, as well as Mahmoud Jamal Hassan Hamdan, who was critically injured and later died of his wounds. During the raid, Israeli forces sealed off the camp and prevented ambulances and journalists from entering it while using a man and his child as human shields, Wafa news agency reported. The director of the ambulance served in Jericho told Al Jazeera that Israeli forces prevented the staff from treating the injured during the military operation. Again, the director of the ambulance service in Jericho told Al Jazeera that Israeli forces prevented his staff from treating the injured during the military operation. The Wednesday raid in Jericho coincided with efforts in Israel to pass legislation allowing for the execution of Palestinian detainees for alleged terror offenses. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir campaigned on a promise to instate the death penalty and repeatedly threatened to send Palestinians to the electric chair, Wafa reported. Meanwhile, on 24 February, UN experts expressed grave concern about efforts to reinstate the death penalty for persons defined as terrorists. The reinstatement of the death penalty is a deeply retrogressive step, more so when, on the face of it, the punishment will apply against minorities living within the state or those who live under the 55-year military occupation and rule, the experts said. Israel Army raids Aqaba Jaber refugee camp in Jericho, 3 injured, 1 critical. A large Israeli armed force today raided Aqaba Jaber refugee camp in the West Bank of Jericho, Ariha, and surrounded a building it claims activists responsible for an attack outside Ariha were in the building. As reports said, 3 were injured by the army gunfire, 1 of them critically. Medics said a young man was shot by live ammunition in the abdomen and was critically wounded. Medics tried to resuscitate him and provide him with treatment, but the Israeli occupation soldiers arrested him, said the medics. The Israeli occupation forces also arrested a number of people in the besieged building as they sealed off the camp and prevented ambulances and journalists from entering it, while also using a man and his child as a human shield. The Palestinian Prisoners Society said the army detained 6 people during its assault on Aqaba Yaber. refugee camp, including 4 siblings from the Shloon family, ranging in age between 55 and 39 years of age. The 24-year-old son of one of the brothers, all former prisoners, and a wounded person identified as Mahmoud Jamal Hamdan. Israeli forces continue to besiege Jericho for a 3rd consecutive day. This is yesterday. Israeli forces continue to besiege the occupied West Bank city of Jericho on Wednesday for the 3rd consecutive day, the official news agency WAFA reported. Official Palestinian sources said that Israeli forces continue to erect checkpoints and barricades at all the main and secondary entrances leading to the city, preventing people from leaving and entering. Photos and video footage on social media platforms show Palestinians waiting in long queues at the checkpoints on the outskirts of the city. The movement restrictions in place have resulted in blocking the access of Palestinians seeking to travel to Jordan, to the Al-Karama border crossing, the only land crossing for Palestinians between the occupied West Bank and Jordan. The besiege has been in place since a Palestinian gunman killed an Israeli-American settler who has served in the Israeli army for several years in a drive-by shooting at an illegal Jewish settlement near Ariha. The drive-by shooting came after Sunday's settler violence in the town of Huwara, south of Nablus. And from IMEMC.org, Army abducts 2 Palestinians in Ariha. On Tuesday evening, Israeli soldiers abducted 2 Palestinians in a village north of Ariha in the northeastern part of occupied West Bank. The Palestinian Prisoners Society said the soldiers invaded Mara Ghazal village before stopping and searching several cars. They added that the soldiers forced the 2 young men out of their car and abducted them before moving them to an unknown destination. On Monday night, the army tightened the siege on Ariha and installed sandhills on streets leading to Palm Farms, north of Ariha and south of the Al Yaber refugee camp. Furthermore, the soldiers invaded Izbet Shufa village, south of the northern West Bank city of Tulkarem, before storming and ransacking man homes while interrogating several Palestinians and inspecting their ID cards. The soldiers also hurled concussion grenades and fired at several homes in the village. Okay, and remember that your engagement through a like, a share, and or a subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Iran's nuclear program politicized? Here's Press TV.
Well, it's very simple. The IAEA, as we've noted before, is compromised. Its staff are largely engaged through they answer to the money mafia that backs up US with its kind of never-ending wars, and their whole demeanor and their whole purpose is really to put Iran in the dock. The idea really being that the international community should international community, because of course that just means those nations which support the Western imperialism in that region, that so-called international community should essentially condemn Iran, should be justifying American military action potentially, or assassination actions, or the bombing of Iran, or whatever else it is that the desperation of Israel and America happens to drive them towards over the coming months or years. Of course, the failure of the JCPOA is down to the unilateral withdrawal of the Americans, and their refusal to compromise on fundamental issues, which are essentially going to violate Iranian sovereignty. You know, they don't want to have any missiles in the region. They don't want them to have any foreign policy towards that region which counters their imperialism. They don't want Iran to possess a defense capability. They want to limit Iran's economic capabilities. And of course, the nuclear question and using the IAEA is just one of the many tools that are being employed to really target Iran. You can go through the cultural psyops of the hundreds of anti-Iranian media channels which the Americans finance. You could talk about the coup d'etats they constantly are plotting and planning, or the color revolutions that continuously fail. The assassination of nuclear scientists in Iran is one of the most blatant violations of human rights and every other law that we know of in this regard. Yet the Israelis have received carte blanche for Mossad to go and do as it likes. So what we're seeing is a kind of a full spectrum attack on Iran, not just militarily encircling it with their own nuclear arsenal from these base camps that they've got surrounding Iran, but also through the cultural psyops, the socio-political psyops generally that we see, through sectarianism, through even ethnicity, by trying to rile up Iranian populations against the Iranian government itself. So they leave no stone unturned, and the nuclear question, of course, is their worst nightmare, even though Iran is committed to not having nuclear weapons.
Well, on years now that Iran is a matter of days or weeks or months away from getting a nuclear weapon. 20 years and still no nuclear weapon. And now they're saying 12 days. The fact that, as you said, this is a vitally important issue. We're talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about the potential annihilation of the planet. And yet these Western countries continue to maintain these falsehoods, to spread them, to demonize Iran, which is the goal, certainly. The United States only wants Israel to have any power in the Middle East. It wants Israel to be the only nuclear power in the Middle East, although why the United States doesn't condemn Israel's nuclear program, and it's known that Israel has nuclear weapons, and yet does condemn Iran's peaceful nuclear program is certainly a mystery. But the international community, as has been mentioned before, should condemn the lies that are coming out of the Western media. The words of the International Atomic Agency, the United Nations branch, should be what is relied on, not rumors, not innuendo, not beliefs that are perpetrated and spoken by U.S. officials. U.S. officials, it's known, the U.S. government has its own agenda. Peace in the world is not on that list. And that has to be kept in mind when anyone is hearing any statements issued by U.S. government officials.
Thank you for that, Robert Fatina, author and journalist. We appreciate it. And thank you, our guest in London, Said Mohsen Abbas. Thank you for your comments.
Annual event.
And From Press TV, IAEA chief to visit Tehran amid calls for agency's non-political approach. The chief of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, is expected to visit Iran on Friday amid mounting calls for the UN nuclear agency to adopt a non-political approach away from the influence of Western countries. Grossi will touch down in the Iranian capital on Friday and hold meetings with the chief of Iran's nuclear agency, Mohammad Islami, on Saturday, local media reported on Wednesday. Earlier in the day, Islami, who heads the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, the AEOI, told reporters that the much-anticipated visit by the IAEA chief will come in the next 1 or 2 days. This will be Grossi's fourth visit to Iran since assuming office in December 2019 and comes ahead of the IAEA Board of Governors meeting next week. The important visit, which according to Islami can help end the deadlock in talks on the revival of the 2015 nuclear deal, comes after a team of UN nuclear agency inspectors visited Iran recently to discuss and resolve technical issues. The issues were reviewed between the two sides during these talks and were concluded and made clear that there is no specific deviation in Iran's nuclear program, Islami said in his remarks dismissing claims in Western media about Iran ramping up enrichment to 84%. A Reuters report last week claimed that Iran's level of enrichment was very close to weapons grade, pointing to uranium particles enriched up to 83.7%. Last month, Bloomberg reported that IAEA inspectors had come across uranium particles enriched to 84%. Dismissing the bogus claims, AEOI spokesman Behrouz Kamalvandi, in an exclusive interview with Press TV last week, said the IAEA publicizes confidential reports about Iran's nuclear activities in order to prepare the ground for fabrications against the country's peaceful atomic energy program. Dismissing the sweeping claims made in leaked reports, Kamalvandi said Iran has only changed modes of enrichment, not unannounced changes to the Design Information Questionnaire, DIQ, as stated by the IAEA. The inspector came and pointed out that the mode has changed. He was right. The mode has changed, but DIQ had not changed, he said in an interview. Commenting on a Bloomberg report that claimed the IAEA is trying to clarify how Iran accumulated uranium enriched to 84%, Iran's nuclear agency spokesman said finding highly enriched uranium particles in the pipes connecting centrifuges was a normal issue. For example, we're producing 5% enriched uranium, 11% particles is seen in it, or we're producing 20% enriched uranium, 47% particle is seen in it. We had several correspondences about this in the past. It's a natural thing in enrichment, he explained. With the removal of misunderstandings between the IAEA and AEOI in recent meetings, observers expect that the upcoming meeting between Grossi and Islami will prepare the ground for increased cooperation between the two sides. Meanwhile, analysts believe that Grossi's visit should not be influenced by political pressures exerted by Western countries and the Israeli regime. Their concerns go back to June 2022 when Grossi landed in Tel Aviv ahead of an IAEA Board of Governors meeting. That session ended up with a resolution that called on Iran to cooperate with the UN nuclear agency's probe into so-called 3 undeclared sites, which has now emerged as a key sticking point in concluding the marathon talks on salvaging the nuclear deal. The probe, Iranian authorities have repeatedly maintained, is based on forged documents provided to the UN nuclear agency by the Israeli regime. Iran insists that the politically motivated probe must be dropped to reach a deal in Vienna. Stressing its peaceful nature of nuclear activities, Iran has welcomed technical cooperation with the IAEA as it's manifested by its inspectors' regular visits to Iranian facilities, despite the fact that these inspectors are not allowed to inspect nuclear facilities in Israel. IAEA's Grossi to visit Iran on Friday report. The visit comes amid new installed media campaign by Western countries and their allies in the region to claim that Iran has increased the level of enrichment to 80%. Iran has rejected the claims of enrichment up to that level. On Wednesday, the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, AEOI, rejected accusations that the country is enriching uranium to 84% purity, asserting that there's been no deviation in Iran's peaceful nuclear activities. Yesterday, media reported that UN nuclear watchdog is in discussions with Iran on the origin of uranium particles enriched up to 83.7% purity at its Fordo enrichment plant. In relevant development, also, Behrouz Kamalvandi, the spokesman for the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, AEOI, said in an interview with Mayor correspondent in Tehran last week, it's normal to see 84% atomic particles in an enrichment process. It means that we may produce 5% enriched uranium and see 11% particles, or we may produce 20% but see 37% particles. The AEOI spokesman's remarks were a reaction to the report by Bloomberg a few days earlier that claimed that IAEA had found uranium enriched to 84% in Iran. And from newsroomodisha.com, no deviation from peaceful nuke activities after talking with IAEA. Tehran. Iran's nuclear chief has said that Tehran and the IAEA have discussed and finalized a number of issues at the level of experts and claimed that there had been no deviation from the country's peaceful nuclear activities. There's no discrepancy between the design information questionnaire submitted by Iran to the International Nuclear Watchdog and the layout of centrifuges at Iran's nuclear facilities. Iranian Students News Agency quoted President of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, AEOI, Mohammad Eslami, as saying on the sidelines of a cabinet meeting on Wednesday. Turning to the safeguards issue, Eslami noted that Iran had held talks with the IAEA and provided clarifications that some people were attempting to claim Tehran had not responded to the IAEA, Xinhua News Agency reported. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi will travel to Iran within the next few days for discussions on certain topics, including the safeguards issues and the closure of the case, he said. Eslami also rejected the claim that Iran has enriched uranium to a level of about 84%. Over the past months, the IAEA has criticized Iran for its lack of cooperation with the agency. On November 17, 2022, the IAEA's Board of Governors passed a resolution proposed by the U.S., Britain, France, and Germany that called on Iran to collaborate with the agency's investigators regarding the alleged traces of uranium at a number of its undeclared sites. Iran has repeatedly rejected such allegations. On February 19th, Bloomberg cited two senior diplomats as claiming that IAEA inspectors in Iran had detected uranium enrichment or enriched to levels just below that needed for a nuclear weapon. On the same day, AEOI spokesman Behrouz Kamalvandi was quoted by RNA as saying that the Bloomberg report was a distortion of the facts and part of a smear campaign. And from Urdu Point, Iran's nuclear authority says IAEA chief will visit this week. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, will visit Iran in the next 2 days, Atomic Energy Organization of Iran Chief Mohammad Eslami said on Wednesday. Media reported earlier in February that IAEA inspectors in Iran allegedly found uranium enriched to 84%, which is enough to make a weapon. And there was an allegation that we left the IAEA's inquiry without response. We held talks on the issue, and Mr. Grossi will visit Iran in an official invitation within 1 or 2 days, Eslami was quoted by Iranian news agency Mehr as saying. The AEOI has insisted that Iran's nuclear program continues to remain exclusively peaceful. And from Mehr News, disputed issue between Iran and IAEA resolved, AEOI chief says. The head of Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Mohammad Eslami, says that the issues of dispute between Iran and IAEA have been resolved. Referring to the report in which non-compliance of centrifuges on or the presence of particles was declared, Eslami said that the case was resolved after the IAEA inspectors' investigations. The investigations revealed that there was no specific deviation according to the AEOI chief. He said these accusations have been raised for 20 years and the negotiations have turned into the JCPOA document, adding that the reason for signing the JCPOA was such accusations. Referring to the visit of the IAEA chief to the Tehran in the coming days, Mohammed Islami noted that Rafael Grossi's visit to Iran can help the JCPOA talks process. Islami also rejected the agency's report about the vagueness of Iran's actions and said that such an issue was mentioned in the report. Regarding the IAEA safeguard claims, he cited several meetings to clarify Iran's answers. Iran has presented its answer in several hundred pages, according to him. Elsewhere in his remarks, Islami referred to the report of uranium particles enriched to nearly 84% and stressed that the issue was related to a sampling a single particle that cannot be seen even with a microscope. What's important is the amount of material that's stored after the production, which the IAEA inspectors observed and made sure was not more than 60%, he emphasized. On Tuesday, media sources reported that IAEA is in discussions with Iran on the origin of uranium particles enriched up to 83.7%. The UN nuclear watchdog is in discussions with Iran on the origin of uranium particles enriched up to 83.7% at its Fordo enrichment plant, a report by the watchdog seen by Reuters committed or confirmed on Tuesday. Behrouz Kamalvandi, the spokesman for the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, said in an interview with Mayor correspondent in Tehran last week, "It's normal to see 84% atomic particles in an enrichment process. It means that we may produce 5% enriched uranium and see 11%, or 20% and see 37%. The AEOI spokesman remarks were a reaction to the report by Bloomberg a few days earlier that claimed that the IAEA had found uranium enriched to 84% in Iran. All right, make sure you watch this space.
Watch this space. Watch this space.
And we will return in just a moment with more news. Israel's gradually taking Ukraine's side in the war against Russia. As the Russia-Ukraine war enters its second year, Israel political and military officials have watched U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to Ukraine closely and seen it as a sign of Washington's support for Kiev. Biden's visit coincided with that of Knesset members Yuli Edelstein and Zeev Elkin and that of Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen just before them. These developments may require Israel to take operational steps, especially given the growing military cooperation between Russia and Iran. Israel's belief that it was good for Cohen's visit to Ukraine to come days before Biden's arrival, or Israelis believe that it was good for Cohen's visit to Ukraine to come days before Biden's arrival. He was the first senior Israeli official to visit in any case, and there was a symbolic dimension in members of the Israeli Knesset standing with the Ukrainians alongside the U.S. president. The expectations in Israel are that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will also visit Kiev soon. Israel has been very cautious about taking sides in the war ever since it was started a year ago by the Russian invasion. Netanyahu refrained from condemning Russia, but didn't express his sympathy with the Ukrainians. However, since his return to power, he started to outline his expected policy towards the war. He said on several occasions that Israel would consider sending weapons to Ukraine and agreed to Cohen's visit. In such circumstances, he could make a solidarity trip to Ukraine without causing a crisis with Moscow. All of these visits to Kiev demonstrate that there's a visible movement by the current Israeli government in its position on the war, unlike the previous government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. There is thus a greater possibility that Israel will respond to Western requests for it to help Ukraine. However, the Israelis are keen not to anger Russia in case this affects the situation in Syria, Moscow's ally. The factors that could lead Israel to change its policy towards Ukraine include the occupation state's need for Western support as Iran gets closer to the nuclear threshold, even as tension between Israel and the West increases over Netanyahu's judicial coup, illegal settlements, and the danger of an explosion with the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. There's also concern that it might be seen as being afraid of Russia, which would harm brand Israel around the world. Cohen's visit to Ukraine angered Moscow. This was obvious when the latter refused to postpone legal action to close down the Jewish agency in Russia. Israel fears that this marks a shift in the Russian position in response to the warming of relations between Tel Aviv and Kiev. The Jewish agency has been working on Russia for many years, encouraging migration to the occupation state and running summer camps and educational institutions. Before the call to close its office down, the Russian government demanded that it should provide special information about Jews who wished to migrate to Israel. The agency refused out of fear for their safety. Moscow's anger over Israeli support for Ukraine may prompt even more Russian alignment with Iran. During Cohen's 12-hour visit to Kiev, he met President Volodymyr Zelensky, arguably the most famous Jew in the world at the moment. And the visit had three objectives: to show that Israel supports Ukraine, just like European countries and the U.S. do, to put the Iranian issue at the forefront, and to increase Israeli humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Israelis' assessment is that Ukraine's become influential internationally, and the Israelis want it on their side against Iran, which represents a common enemy. Cohen and Zelensky discussed ways to deal with the threat of Iranian drones being used in Ukraine by Russia, and they agreed to deepen cooperation in the fight against Iran in the international arena. Although Israel promised to supply Ukraine with the Iron Dome missile defense system 6 months ago, it's not yet done so. Ukraine also asked Israel for a loan, a request to which Tel Aviv has not yet responded either way. This is rather humiliating, especially for a country at war. With this in mind, and given the near-neutral policies of the Israeli governments led by Bennett, Lapid, and Netanyahu, goodwill in Ukraine towards Israel is at an all-time low. And we can therefore only expect to see a gradual change in Israel regarding the supply of weapons to Kiev. Nevertheless, the details of Cohen's visit to Ukraine revealed the change in Israel policy towards the war, and its difference to the policy of the two previous governments. Netanyahu's current coalition government is leaning towards a position closer to the one of the warring parties without fully siding with it, which may lead to a disagreement between Tel Aviv and the other party. This visit, a full year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, reveals new Israeli trends toward this important international issue. And from IJAC, Israel's Ukraine-Russia dilemma. The inauguration of Benjamin Netanyahu's new government has led to increased international pressure for a change in Israel's semi-neutral reserve position on the war in Ukraine. On the one hand, Washington and like-minded Western countries demand that Jerusalem go the extra mile in supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, the Kremlin expects Netanyahu, who's boasted in the past about having an extraordinarily close relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, to preserve and deepen Russian-Israel cooperation. What considerations drive the Russian and the Israeli thinking about each other, and will Netanyahu change his country's policy towards Russia? From the Russian perspective, Israel remains, despite the Russian-Western rupture, one of the friendliest Western-oriented countries. Israel continues a high-level political dialogue with the Kremlin. It staunchly refuses to give offensive weapons to Ukraine. It hasn't imposed national economic sanctions on Russia. It hasn't abolished flights to and from Russia. And there's still a visa-free regime between the two countries, and it didn't expel Russian diplomats. Russia sees Israel as an important regional power capable of inflicting severe military and political reputational damage on Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin is known for his sympathy for Israel and the Jewish people, and over the years has invested heavily in his relationship with Netanyahu in the expectation that the latter might help bridge the gaps between Moscow and Washington. From the Israeli perspective, the war in Ukraine put potential Russian damage to Israel's national security at the forefront of the bilateral relationship and diminished the benefits to Israel from this relationship. Three main threat scenarios dominate the Israel view of Russia: that the Russians would exploit their hegemony in Syria to restrict Israeli freedom of military operations therein, that they would cooperate closely with Iran against Israel, or that Moscow would hinder the repatriation of Russian Jews to Israel. In the eyes of Jerusalem decision-makers, Russia's status as the most stubborn supporter of Iran's clerical regime among global powers is an important factor in Israel's multifaceted confrontation with Tehran. Moscow's growing use of Iranian weapons for the war in Ukraine, mainly attack drones, and export routes to Asia through Iranian territory have yet to expand into joint action between the two countries against Israeli operations in Syria. And maybe at some point we'll unpack this whole Iran drone issue, Iran supplying drones to other countries. There have been some reports on that have been pretty in-depth, and it doesn't seem to be as significant as it's being made out to be. To hear something over and over and over again, it just makes it seem that severity of it is really high. But in essence, it's not. The drones themselves are made from parts that are from all over they can be found all over the world. The only part that is probably from Iran is the engine itself, and the technology itself is almost at this point an open technology because it's something that a lot of people have picked up on. So to say that Iran is providing the drones is a heavy overstatement. At the same time, the Israelis are anxious about growing security cooperation between Moscow and Tehran, including the joint venture to produce Iranian-designed drones in Russia, the sale of Russian military-grade imaging satellites to Iran, and reports that advanced Su-35 fighter jets are soon to be supplied to Tehran. Moscow pays attention to the public debate inside Israel about a possible change of course considering the Ukraine war, and uses info warfare to try to dissuade Jerusalem by raising the threat that Russia will retaliate by obstructing Israeli freedom of operations in Syria. Still, looking at the poor Russian military performance in Ukraine, many Israeli pundits question whether the small Russian military contingent in Syria is realistically capable of or willing to limit the ability of the Israeli Air Force to operate in that arena. In the past, Israel succeeded in convincing Russia to abolish some of its arms deals with Iran and restrain Iranian nuclear ambitions. Netanyahu may be hoping to do so again. Israel still thinks that the nuclearization of Iran is contrary to Russian interests, yet Jerusalem has no illusions that Moscow would be prepared to undertake any proactive diplomacy to deter Tehran from crossing dangerous red lines toward becoming a nuclear threshold state. Moscow has identified Israeli fears that it stopped AEOI immigration to Israel of Russian Jews and initiated legal proceedings in July 2022 to terminate the activities of the Jewish agency in Russia, the body which facilitates such immigration. Court deliberations on the decision resumed on February 17th after being postponed repeatedly since August. This might serve as yet another signal from the Kremlin to Netanyahu to refrain from drifting further away from Moscow, although the prolongation of the procedure implies that the threat of shutdown serves the Kremlin's interests better than the actual closure of the Jewish agency's offices would. While Israel has not imposed national sanctions on Russia and indeed lacks a legislation framework for doing so, the scope of economic cooperation between the countries has dwindled, as Israel has acted vigorously to find substitutes for importing Russian oils and grains. The memory of the Holocaust, which provided the seemingly uncontroversial basis for relations due to Israel's gratitude over the Red Army's liberation of the main Nazi concentration camps in World War II, became toxic after Moscow branded Ukraine, led by the Jewish President Volodymyr Zelensky, a Nazi regime. Moreover, Israelis cannot accept the increased usage by the Russian propaganda machine of anti-Semitic narrative. This article, I may not read the rest of this article because I was thinking just before this paragraph that this is implying bias, but at this point it's gone past implying, right? So Jews can't be Nazis. First thing. That's wrong. Jews can be Nazis. The connection between the two is not, there are German Jews that were Nazis. And not only that, there are people who are abused by Nazis and subjugated by Nazis who revere them and want to be like them. And so they act out in ways not unlike Stanislav, Galicia, and historical Ukraine. The crucial predicament for Israel comes from Western demands to do more Ukraine, especially in the military realm. The Israeli National Security Council is reportedly conducting an examination of Israel's policies on the issue. Okay, so let's move on. And here we have Israel condemns Russian aggression but has a unique stance, head of Israel Foreign Ministry. Eli Cohen, Israel Foreign Minister, said that Israel condemns Russian aggression but notes the unique position of Jerusalem. Cohen said that, of course, we condemn the Russian aggression, but noted Jerusalem's unique position.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
We are not like your country, meaning Germany. Russia is a pivot player in our region. Cohen also recalled his recent visit to Kiev. It was the first visit of a high-ranking Israel official to Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. Israel Foreign Minister Eli Cohen has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev and promised to supply Ukraine with a civilian air defense system. During his visit to Ukraine, Cohen said that Israel intends to support the peace formula proposed by President Volodymyr Zelensky. During his meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron on Thursday, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, announced that he's ready to send military things to Ukraine. And the friction between Israel and Russia following the war in Ukraine. Israel has ties with Russia, yet there is tension. There's a possibility that this is biased as well, so see if we get through it. Israel has ties with Russia, yet there's tension between them following the war in Ukraine, mostly because of Iran. Russia receives from Iran military aid such as drones, which assist Russia's air war effort. In return, Russia provides unprecedented level of military aid to Iran. Russia's assistance to Iran, including in other issues such as regarding Syria and Iran's nuclear program, caused friction between Israel and Russia, and in the worst case, it could bring a clash between their militaries. Iran and the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine puts Israel in a tough spot. Israel does not want to aggravate Russia because of several interests, including protecting the Jews who live in Russia who might be at risk if Israel supports Ukraine. On the other hand, Israel certainly does not associate itself in any way as a Russian partner in the war in Ukraine. Israel even gave some civilian aid to Ukraine. Russia warned Israel not to provide weapons to Ukraine, yet Israel might do it in coordination with the United States. Such an Israel move depends, among others, on how Russia cooperates with Iran. Iran sold Russia drones that attacked Ukrainian cities. Iran and Russia also plan to build drones together. Ukrainian air defense might not be able to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles if they're delivered to Russia. Iran's military aid to Russia concerned Israel because Iran would learn from the war in Ukraine how to improve its drones and missiles. Later on, Iran can use them against... This is a lot of speculation, once again. Let's see. And the entire article is pretty much about Iran's nuclear program, which is very interesting. And this is from realcleardefense.com. I mean, we know what they're about. They sell weapons for sure, or have something to do with the military-industrial complex. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles covering Israel. In the next war, Israel might be hit daily by up to 2,000 rockets and missiles. Furthermore, Israel is concerned about Hezbollah's effort, which receives strong Iranian support, aimed at improving the accuracy of some of its missiles, which would allow Hezbollah to pinpoint targets in Israel. And it could severely damage Israel's civilian and military infrastructure. Therefore, Israel is eager to slow down this Hezbollah project by bombing inside Syria. If Russia, as a favor to Iran following Iranian aid in Ukraine, tries to restrain Israel's operation in Syria, it would assist Hezbollah in upgrading its missiles. This is another factor that could increase the friction between Israel and Russia. Interesting. Okay, watch this space.
Watch this space.
And we shall return with more news in just a moment. Channel.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark.
Beam me up.
Lock on transporters. Beam us up.
Beam us up, quickly.
Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up.
Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up. Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.